So the official welcome to everybody, the latest of our quarterly economic indicator report publications, and also our live update in association with Angus Economics and Shona. Always a super interesting piece of work, and we're really indebted to the businesses that take the time to fill in the survey and who come on and kind of and listen to the output from this, and then share the output and use this to help other businesses get a sense of what's happening in Dundee and Angus. It helps policymakers, so it helps local authorities, it helps national organisations and policymakers be able to understand what's happening to the business community in our local area. It also helps, because we do this in two parts, it's a look back on what the quarter was like for businesses, but it's also a look forward and a sense of what business sentiment is like. And that's always really interesting, because we can then look at our data, we can look at how it pertains to Scotland and what's happening in Scotland, into the UK, and then in some parts we can look at it and how we compare to the global trends and what's going on in the wider economy. So super interesting. But as always, there's always a little bit of a lag, and Shona does such a lot of hard work, and then probably comes on with all sorts of and caveats, and this happens, and and I think if we weren't in, I'm putting words in your mouth, Shona, now, but if we weren't in COVID times, I don't think there would be such large caveats. It's just that no sooner than businesses respond and give us their data, and we send all that data over to you, a COVID guidance or restriction or something happens that just causes the sectors that are so prevalent in our area to get a kind of a curveball from left field, if I'm not mixing all sorts of metaphors there. Today we're going to hear about what Q4 was like, and we'll be able to then hear from Shona about some of the other numbers that get published alongside our data that help her put a picture together. And as always, she has the very hard task of me having to share our slides, and then we'll come on at the end and have a bit of a chat. So Shona, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to work with us on this. It's we're coming up for having done this for 2 years, and where does all that time go? It's absolutely ridiculous, but it's brilliant work, and I'm really, really proud of it. So Shona, thank you very much. So I'm going to allow you to come in, Shona, and while you're unmuting, I'm going to find the presentation, mute myself, and share it all at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Alison, and good morning, everybody. So as Alison said, the survey was completed round about the end of November, beginning of December, and obviously quite a lot has happened since then. So as we go through everything, we'll try and put all of that into context. But as usual, the first slide I want to look at is GDP, which is gross domestic product. It's a good measure of economic activity, and I use it to sort of set the background against which the survey was undertaken. And this chart is looking at the progress of GDP over the last 2 years while we've lived through the COVID pandemic. And if you look at the pink line, that's the headline measure of GDP. And you can see the sort of large collapse that we had at the start of this process, then strong recovery as we all came out of the first lockdown, waning again back into the second lockdown, another recovery last summer, but a bit more muted. And then just as our survey was being undertaken, growth was softening yet again. And in fact, GDP, I'm just looking for the numbers here, it fell from 5.4% in the second quarter to just 1.1% in the third quarter. But when you look at a key headline like this, it's often easy to miss what's actually going on underneath, because the GDP number is really just an average of all the different components. So I've selected two components here, one which reflects what was going on for us all at the household level, and the second one with the fancy title GFCF, which stands for Gross Fixed Capital Formation, is a measure of investment. So it relates more to what's going on in the corporate sector. And you can see that at the beginning of this process, everything was moving in line. There was very little to distinguish between the different components. But as we came out of the first lockdown, it was the businesses which were actually performing a bit better. I think the consumer was still very wary. A lot of people still on furlough, still worried about their future employment, and just a bit more guarded in behaviour and restricted as well. Let's face it, we were still and still are living under several restrictions. But really, since the sort of emergence from the second lockdown, we've seen a different story, and households seem to be more confident than businesses now, which is interesting. It's telling us that, you know, they're holding up a little bit better. I think they feel they've come through this, they've survived, and just being a little bit more optimistic about the future. Whereas I think businesses are now being a bit more guarded, especially in relation to investment spending. And this more positive news about the consumer has also popped up in a survey which the Scottish Government does. It's a relatively new survey, but it is quite an interesting one. And if you have a consumer-facing business, it's probably worth having a regular look at it. This is the Scottish Consumer Sentiment Indicator. They publish it quarterly, and it actually turned positive for the first time since the second quarter of 2016, which is quite a long time ago, and that's actually when we had the Brexit referendum. So it's been negative since then, and it's now turned positive. It seems it's turned positive because households are showing a big improvement in their assessment of the economy. I think they feel that, you know, we've survived everything that's been thrown at us, and also their attitude to spending has improved considerably. So again, just feeling better about the situation, having got through it. If they were furloughed, returning to work, the labour market, we've had new numbers this morning, still looking quite healthy, although there's still some caveats there. But as I say, the general impression is that households coming through all this feeling a bit stronger, and that has to be good news. However, if you look at the sort of lime green coloured line, which is showing investment spending, the story there is a bit more cautious. And in fact, in the last quarter, investment spending turned negative, which is always a bit of a red flag. So that's just confirming that the business sector's had a lot to cope with, and, you know, not willing to look ahead to invest as much on the whole, because we'll see some different stories when we look at what's going on in our region. And I have to say, another reason for this fall in investment is that it does include inventories, and with supply chain challenges and shortages, that does mean that sometimes companies would like to be investing more but haven't been able to. So we'll have to take that into account as well. So I mean, that's the background against which our survey was undertaken. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see some of the key results. In the past, when we've shown this chart, we've just looked at the results for this quarter in isolation. But I thought that this time it's worth comparing the results of this survey with similar results for the previous survey in the third quarter. So the pink bars are showing the history, if you like, and the orange bars are showing the results this time. And I think it's quite clear that in general, there's been some degree of deterioration in the results, and that's just reflecting the tougher operating conditions. However, if we're looking for the good news here, there definitely is some good news, and that's the fact that apart from employment, every single variable is still positive. So it's still showing a net balance, which is encouraging overall. We measure everything in terms of net balances, which is to show the extent to which the overall view of a sector or on a topic is positive or negative. So basically, we calculate the net balance by taking the percentage of companies who report that something has increased, and from that we subtract the percentage of companies who say that a variable has decreased, and the difference between those gives us the net balance. So as an example, if 80% of respondents said that sales had improved, 10% said they were constant and 10% said they had declined, then the net balance would be 70%. It would be the 80% positive subtracting the 10% negative. So as I say, the overall message here is showing some deterioration in the key variables, but everything's, apart from employment, still showing a positive reading. The highest reading overall is showing an intention to increase prices. And we know from answers to other questions in the survey that this isn't in response to superb demand and great levels of activity. This is in response to rising prices and rising costs, and we'll come on to look at that later in the survey. We can take heart from the results in that both revenue and orders, which are shown towards the left of the chart, they're still relatively strong. In the case of revenue, the net balance has fallen from 41 to 32, which is still a respectable reading. And in the case of orders, the net balance has fallen from 32 to 26, which again is still respectable. What's not so good though is the readings for cash flow and profits. In the case of cash flow, it's fallen from 23 to just 6, and the case of profits has fallen from 36 to just 10. So these definitely much weaker readings, and I think that has also had an impact on the overall optimism, which you can see at the far left of the chart. Other results to note, in the case of investment, there has been a decrease there, but it's still holding up relatively well. And last time that was quite strong. And in the case of employment, that is our weakest reading. Disappointing to see that it's fallen below 0, which is telling us that overall employment was cut. And this is the first negative that we've seen in this variable since the first quarter of the year. And the turnaround has been significant. So last time the reading was plus 30, it's fallen to minus 3, so a turnaround of minus 33 points. So what's the overall message here? I think, looking at this chart, we can say that there is evidence business conditions have deteriorated since the summer, but the fall still contained, and still some key variables holding up quite well, such as revenue and orders, and possibly even investment. But it is worrying to see the deterioration in both profits and cash flow, because these are two very significant variables when it comes to determining the health of a business and even its ability to survive. And because of this, I think it's understandable that so many businesses are obviously seeking to increase prices to try to shore up their profitability and ease their cash flow. So what I want to do now is move on and start to look at each of these variables in a bit more detail. So this first chart is looking at business optimism. Are we able to move the chart? There we go. Thank you. So this is looking at business optimism against 1 year ago and against 3 months ago. So if we start with the pink bars, this is showing the movement in optimism over the last year. And the results show that optimism is generally higher than it was last year. If you look down at the bottom of the chart, you can see the total net balance, and it was plus 20. So overall, companies feeling more optimistic than they were in the fourth quarter of 2020. The biggest improvement in terms of sectors came in the construction sector and the tourism sector. But there's also a higher level of optimism in education, in manufacturing, and even in business services. And that's obviously good to see. If we look at the blue bars, this is showing optimism over the last 3 months. And this is a bit more disappointing. The net balance is just plus 6, as you can see at the bottom of the chart. The sectors which stand out here are hospitality and manufacturing. These have been positive. In the case of hospitality, clearly helped by more opening up of businesses. But there's been a sharp deterioration in optimism from both the agricultural sector and the healthcare sector, and that gives us some cause for concern. In the case of agriculture, it might be that there's some seasonal impact in there. If there's anybody on the call from the agricultural sector, you can say that's either right or wrong, but that could be one reason, but that certainly doesn't stack up for the deterioration in optimism in the healthcare sector. Overall, though, these results are sort of fitting in well with what we saw for all of the key variables. This is sort of tying it up together and giving the overall impression. So we clearly are in a different place from where we were at the end of 2020, much more positive place, and that is obviously good to see. But the fact that the 3-month results are a bit weaker does give us some cause for concern. And I think it's not too big a surprise, because the survey was being undertaken just at the time when we'd heard about some tax increases coming through, an increase in national insurance, and the Omicron variant had just appeared, and there was a lot of concern about what was about to happen. Were we going to be living under more restrictions again? Optimism is also a very subjective measure. So what I want to do now is move on and look at something which is more objectively measured, and that is business revenue. So this chart is looking at revenue over the last quarter, and you can see that the numbers are all fairly positive. More than 91% of firms have said that their export-related revenue has increased or remained constant over the last 3 months, and that's obviously good to see. What the bars on the left are telling us, which is the total figures, they're telling us that 45% of respondents said that total revenues had increased. 42% said revenue had remained the same over the last quarter, and 13% said revenue had actually fallen. So that gives us a net balance of plus 32%, which you can see in the table. It's still positive, it's still a relatively high number, and it's still giving us a fairly strong message. But it was plus 41 in the last survey, so we have to be aware that it's not as good as it was last time. So why has it deteriorated? Well, the net balances for revenue raised in Scotland in the domestic economy and in the rest of the UK have also remained positive, as you can see in the table. And the exception is export sales, where we've now got 33% of firms saying revenue has increased and 58% saying no change. So that's giving us a net balance of plus 25, which is much higher than we saw last time. And so export sales holding up a bit better. So the deterioration where it's come is in terms of sales within the domestic economy of Scotland and also in the rest of the UK. But if you look at these net balances, as I say, it's not too much to worry about at the moment, but it is throwing up a red flag of something that we need to watch quite closely going forward to see if we don't want to see any further deterioration in this. At the sector level, we're not showing the sectors here, but I can tell you that hospitality showed the biggest improvement in revenue over the last 3 months, clearly helped by the lack of any lockdown measures. But the results from agriculture and healthcare, those two sectors again, these were the weakest, the most muted results that we got in the survey. And although we're not showing the figures here, we had a question in the survey about expected revenue and what was revenue expected to do over the next 3 months. And in this case, although sales within Scotland are expected to hold up relatively well, the highest net balance is recorded for sales to the rest of the UK. So that's quite confident. The reading was plus 31, so a big improvement from the plus 25 recorded for current sales. And if we look forward, it's the healthcare sector which is the most optimistic about revenue. That's encouraging because, as I said, when we're talking about current revenue, the healthcare sector was one of the weakest. So it's good to see that they see themselves getting over whatever the current problems are. The construction sector is a bit more concerned about future sales, but there could be a seasonal impact in there, or it could be a reflection of some of the supply chain issues that have been widely reported. It might even just be a levelling off, because in our last few surveys, construction has been, the strongest contributor. So the fact that we're seeing that being a bit more muted at the moment could just be the fact that, you can't stay that strong forever. Again, that's something that we need to watch going forward. So companies are all very confident about future revenue, and this next variable we're going to look at is orders, which lets us see sort of how much of that change has possibly already been baked in, with higher orders coming through. So we're looking at how orders have performed over the last 3 months. If you look at total orders at the top of the chart, 48% of respondents said orders had increased, 29% say orders are unchanged over the last 3 months, and 23% say orders have declined. So this is giving us a net balance of 26%, and that's lower than the figure of 33, which was recorded in the previous quarter. So as in the case of revenue, the report is a bit weaker than last time, but it's still holding up okay. It's still relatively strong within itself. So there's no reason to be concerned yet, but there is reason to keep a close eye on this. Orders are obviously a key variable, so we do need to watch this closely in the next survey. In terms of geography, the biggest deterioration in orders has come from the rest of the UK. The net balance there has fallen to plus 16. Having said that, this was really strong in the previous survey in Q3. So it could be that we're seeing a bit of a correction there, that there had been a sort of rush in orders and things are now levelling off. So again, that's something we need to watch going forward. At the sectoral level, the most positive assessment of orders that we have has come from the tourism sector. And I think that reflects greater freedoms in terms of travel and so on. Yet again, the most downbeat assessments come from both agriculture and healthcare. These two sectors were not having a good time in Q4. Same two sectors facing the toughest conditions. Although we've got some concerns about current orders in that we've seen it softening, our survey also asked participants about expected orders. And although we don't have the chart here, I can say that the assessment was pretty strong. In fact, 90% of respondents expect orders to increase or remain unchanged over the next 3 months. And that's really encouraging to see. So in the case of expected orders, we then again got a complete switch around, this time from both agriculture and healthcare. So both reporting the weakest orders over the last 3 months, but both sectors expecting the strongest improvement over the next 3 months. So that's good to see, and possibly a bit of bounce back or catch up there. The most negative assessment of future orders actually comes from the finance and insurance sector. And that's quite unusual. Usually the sector sort of flies beneath the radar. Is usually not the sort of highest at anything or the lowest. So there's definitely some concerns creeping in there, and we'll come back to mention that again later in the presentation. So that's the situation for sales and possibly future sales through orders. I want to move on now and look at two of the weakest variables that we've seen, and these are profits and cash flow. So, I mean, these are obviously critical variables, both for the survival of businesses and also for long-term prospects and the ability to invest going forward. So it's good to see that both the net balances remain positive so far, and this is the third successive quarter in which that's been the case, as you can see in the table. What is disappointing, though, is that the net balances are much lower than before. As I said, profits have fallen from 36 to just 10, and the cash flow numbers have fallen from 23 to just 6. So disappointing in terms of net balances, reflecting more challenging conditions facing businesses over the last 3 months. And one of the biggest challenges has clearly been the increase in costs, and that can quickly sort of eat away at both profits and cash flow. If we focus on what's happening at the sector level, it was construction sector which came out as the most positive, and agriculture and healthcare were the least positive. So the same two sectors once again. In fact, both of these sectors reported overall that profits had decreased over the quarter. But it's no surprise then to see that both agriculture and healthcare were also the weakest in terms of cash flow. And in terms of the most positive ones, it was education and finance and insurance. So they're feeling okay about cash flow, but agriculture and healthcare feeling poorly about both profits and cash flow, which is quite a serious position to be in. And of course, both profits and cash flow can be key determinants of investment. So I want to move on now and look at investment across the region. If you remember, our GDP chart was showing investment at the headline level in terms of gross capital spending. This is looking at investment across our region and is influenced by the makeup of the corporate sector in Dundee and Angus. So the net balance for investment has fallen from a record high of plus 40 in the third quarter to a considerably lower figure of plus 22 in the fourth quarter. So it's lower, but it is still positive, which gives us some reassurance. But although the reading is lower, you know, we can take some comfort from the fact that 82% of local businesses have reported that investment has either increased or remained stable over the last 3 months. So I think that helps to put the deterioration into context. If we look at sector trends in this chart, and what we're looking at is the split between capital investment and investment in people. So the orange bars are showing investment in capital and the pink bars are showing training investment. And overall, I think the chart is telling us that training investment has been relatively stronger over the last few months. If you look at the total figures at the bottom of the chart, you can see that the net balance for training investment is plus 27, while the net balance for capital investment is plus 20. So there's not a lot in it, but training overall looks slightly stronger. This could be partly to do with seasonality. Again, capital investment might be getting held back a bit by some of the supply chain issues. It could be that companies are willing to invest but not able to carry out that expenditure at the moment. And it could be that we'll see more capital investment coming through in 2022. What is interesting is that although so far the readings for the healthcare sector have been relatively negative, when it comes to investment, the sector appears to be strong in terms of investment in both capital and training. So that is encouraging to see. So the fact that this sector sees better orders and is willing to invest gives us some confidence. Manufacturing is also a fairly strong sector in terms of investment spending, and business services is in positive territory too. Investment has been weaker in the hospitality sector, and I think that's totally understandable given the sort of seesaw that sector has had to go through over the last couple of years. And capital spending has been cut in both agriculture and the tourism sectors. Investment in training, that's obviously important for skills and confidence of the workforce. So what I want to do now is move on and look at the workforce itself in terms of employment in the region. And this was the disappointing variable in this survey. So given the real challenges that we're all facing over the last 2 years, it is understandable that there is some negativity coming through at the moment. The blue lines, the purple lines are showing recent moves in employment, and this is where the disappointment lies. This is where you're seeing readings lying to the left of the chart, which is the negative territory. So if you look at the bottom of the chart, the net balance overall has turned negative, but a small reading of just -3. But if you remember from the key variables chart, the decline had been considerable because it came from a reading of +30 last time. So this reading is telling us that employment has been cut overall. And you can see, looking at the purple bars on the left-hand side of the chart, that the sectors involved have been construction, healthcare and tourism. These are the sectors where the cuts have had to be made. However, there could be a bit of a seasonal element there, particularly in the case of both construction and tourism. And that's something that we'll see when we look at the results next time round. The reason that I say that is that if you look at the blue bars on the right-hand side of the chart, this is showing us the expectations. And you can see that most sectors are actually positive in terms of expectations. A couple of sectors are saying no change, but the rest are all giving a positive reading, so intending to increase employment. So that's encouraging to see that even those which have had to cut employment over the last 3 months are expecting to replace workers in the next 3 months. And that's leading me to believe that there might be some seasonality in there, which is putting a sort of positive spin on the results. So, you know, I think that the outlook for employment in our region looks very positive, and it would be great if that does come to pass. But we have to remember again that the timing of this survey could prove to be critical. So it was undertaken just as the new variant of coronavirus was making an appearance, and that might have had an impact on some sectors in the lead up to Christmas. So it might be that when we do see what's happened to employment in this period, it may turn out to be a bit weaker than people had been expecting. So that's the employment situation. I want to move on now and look at this, what was the strongest variable in our survey, and that was expected prices. So this chart is looking at the sectoral level at price intentions. The purple lines are showing an intention to increase prices. The red lines are showing the intention to keep prices unchanged. And the pink line, and you'll see there are absolutely no pink lines or pink bars on this chart, and that is showing any companies which are intending to cut prices. So there's no intention to cut prices at all. Some sectors looking to keep prices where they are, and an increasing number of sectors and companies looking to raise prices. So the net balance, if you look at the bottom of the chart, is showing that overall it's a positive reading for increasing prices. The net balance of companies expecting to increase prices over the next 3 months has moved up from +40 last time to +53 this time, making it the strongest reading for any of our variables. I think what we're seeing is that 53% of companies are expecting to increase prices and 47% expecting prices to remain unchanged. Again, I think the timing of the survey could prove to be quite telling, and given that energy costs, etc., have risen much further since this reading, this is something that we're likely to see even more of in a higher net balance in the next survey as companies struggle to cope with the increased costs that they're facing. If we're looking at the sector level, as we are in this chart, you can see that the pressure to raise prices is highest in both the construction and education sectors. And that's Certainly in the case of construction, we know that raw material prices are coming through. There's also considerable pressure in business services, hospitality, manufacturing and tourism. All these sectors quite keen to increase prices. What is striking and not so positive is that this pressure to raise prices, as I said, is due to higher costs and not to higher levels of activity. So businesses across the region are clearly facing pressures, and they're challenged by increased costs and overheads, and the fact that raw materials are rising and wages rising too. So all of that means that although companies are expecting to be able to increase prices, it's not a positive move. It's not that they're expecting profitability to improve and cash flow to improve. They're trying to do it to shore up these variables. So what impact is this having on their expectations of future prospects? If we move on to this next slide, we can see the results for that question. So again, this is showing net balances, and it's showing how companies expect their business profits to move over the next year. So we've moved out from a 3-month view to a view over the whole of 2022. The last time we did the survey, the net balance, if you look at the bottom of the chart, the total net balance was extremely positive. It was plus 60. This time it's waned a bit, it's fallen to plus 40. That's still a strong reading, but we have to be aware of the fact that, you know, it has dipped by 20 points. But at least it's still positive, and it's still telling us that businesses are fairly confident about business prospects. However, underlying this data, we had responses from 7% of companies saying that, or 7% of respondents to the survey saying that they did actually have some doubt about their ability to survive. So that's something that we can't take lightly at all, and need to be very wary of. The most optimistic sectors, as you can see from the chart, are agriculture, construction and healthcare. And in these sectors, every participant who responded to our survey expects business conditions to improve. So that's really good. And again, it's a complete reversal of the poorer readings we've had from agriculture and healthcare when talking about the current situation. So it's really good to see that they're so optimistic about the future. Sentiment is also fairly strong, as you can see, in business services, manufacturing and tourism. So that's encouraging. Sentiment in education and hospitality sectors is relatively weaker, given that companies in these sectors expect no change. So it could be worse, but it would be more encouraging if we had seen that they were expecting conditions to improve. The outlier here, and again, it's an interesting reading, is the finance and insurance sector. So this is the only sector which is expecting conditions to worsen over the next year. And if you remember, this was the sector where orders were seen just to their business, further supply chain challenges, rising costs, etc., and whether all of these things are going to have an impact on profits and even just on revenue going forward. So I'd say this sector hasn't really come to the fore much in previous surveys, and so it's interesting to see that this time there is more negativity there with regard to orders and future business prospects. So again, something to keep an eye on. So we've gone through all of the variables. What I want to do now is show how we pull it together in terms of our chamber business sentiment indicator. So this next chart is showing the two measures that we use. The blue or navy blue line, at least on my screen, is showing current conditions, and the orange line is showing expectations. So what we do is we take all the results from the survey, we assess all the sort of current readings that we have, and we combine these to get the current conditions indicator. And likewise, all the sort of forward-looking results that we get, we combine to produce our expectations index. And the current indicator is assessing trading conditions over the last 3 months. So it's encouraging to see that it's still positive, but it's not as positive as it was before. It's fallen from a reading of 25 last time to a reading of 11 now. And that's, if you look back on the line, you can see that's the lowest that we've had since last March. The orange line is showing business expectations indicator, and that's assessing future trade and activity. That's also deteriorated a bit. Last time it was at a record high level of 43%, and this time it's fallen to +30. So it's still strong, but it has deteriorated in line with a lot of the other results. What is also interesting and important is that expectations are still riding higher than current conditions. And it's always good if the corporate sector is feeling more optimistic about the future, because that suggests that they'll be more willing to invest, more willing to employ, and can see future growth coming through. So that is definitely encouraging. So, you know, the results overall are a bit softer than they were in Q3, but given, as we've talked about, the situation at the time that the survey was being undertaken, I don't think that's too surprising. I think if we were to ask the same questions today that we were asking back in November, some sectors who had been hit more by the rise of the Omicron variant would be giving us weaker readings, but other sectors have possibly come through this relatively unscathed. Where no firm, I think, has escaped is in terms of having to face higher costs, and some of the sort of increases in costs are a bit eye-watering. So I thought before we sort of finish through the presentation, I want to look at some of the economic variables which are impacting us now and likely to impact us in the next few weeks and months. And the focus is very much on inflation and monetary policy. So the first chart that I want to look at is contributions to the inflation rate. This is looking, when we talk about inflation, we're really talking about price increases as they affect us as households rather than within the corporate sector itself. So with our household hat on, we're clearly seeing inflation increasing. In the last reading, which was for November, inflation measured when it includes housing costs increased from 3.8% to 4.6%. I should say we've got a new reading coming out tomorrow, so chances are it will be even higher. But inflation is measuring what has happened to prices over the last year. And so what was happening this time last year can be just as important in the calculation of the inflation rate as what is happening now. And last year inflation was very, very weak. In fact, in November of last year, inflation, or November 2020, inflation was just 0.6%. It was very low. There were concerns about deflation. You know, we were sort of living through stricter restrictions related to the pandemic and so on, very weak activity. And so that's a weak comparison, which makes current inflation look higher. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, I'm not belittling the cost increases by any means. They are tough to bear and they are sizable. But I'm just saying in the calculation of inflation, and the fact that we had so much weakness last year means that the readings look even higher. And what that means is as we progress over the next few months, and inflation was starting to creep in last year, the overall headline rate could start to ease. But it's not going to mean that the actual costs we're facing are easing. It's just a measurement over the year. So this chart is looking at contributions to the inflation rate to see where this increase is coming from. So inflation in November was measured at 4.6%. And what this is doing is taking, you know, where are each of these 4.6 points coming from? So the two key categories, as you can see here, transport and household services. So in the case of transport, it's responsible for 1.3 or 1.34 of the 4.6, and household services responsible for almost 1.3. So if you add those together, they're accounting for 2.6 of the 4.6. So 57% of the inflation we're seeing is coming from transport and household services. And in the case of household services, it's relating to utility costs. So again, the whole thing is about energy costs. If we were to strip these out, then you've got inflation running at around 2%. So it hasn't got into the other sectors yet. It's purely based around energy costs. But the problem with energy costs is they do feed into other sectors because most goods have to be transported. And so the cost of rising energy starts to creep in throughout all the other sectors too. So it is something that is likely to be with us for a while. In the case of transport, there are two reasons for the big increase in inflation. The first one is the petrol price. So we're currently living with a petrol price of about 145, 146 pence a litre. That's a record high. It's up 29% year on year. So fuel cost inflation is huge. The second contribution is coming from second-hand cars. And this is the fact that they've increased by 31% since April. This is because we've got a global semiconductor shortage, which is meaning there's not so many new cars coming onto the market. We had fewer one-year-old cars coming onto the market this year because there were so few sales last year because of restrictions and COVID. And a lot of lease contracts have been extended, so there's fewer part exchanges coming through. So basically, we've got a shortage of new cars coming into the country, and we've got a shortage of second-hand cars coming onto the market, and that has pushed car prices up considerably, and that is one of the key reasons for inflation at the moment. In terms of housing and household services, the inflation that's coming through is, as I said, related to utilities. Energy costs up more than 50% over the last 6 months for households. Gas prices at record high, and the price cap was increased by 12% to cover the period from October to March. But we know that there's going to be another huge increase coming through, and I think that is going to be announced soon. But from April, people are talking at the moment of another sort of 50% increase coming through in terms of utility prices. So the burden is going to be huge on households, and clearly is going to have an impact on demand from other sectors, because these are all necessities that we have to buy, and that just leaves us with less money to spend on the more discretionary items that we would like to purchase. So the signs of inflation continuing are there, and as I say, at the moment it's limited to the energy market, but that is going to seep through into other sectors. To see how it's affecting the corporate sector, I want to look now at producer prices. So this next chart is looking at both input and output prices as facing the corporate sector. So output price inflation is shown by the orange line, and input price inflation is the green line. And this inflation is much higher. And this is the one that's more relevant to us as business owners. So input price inflation is running at 14.3%. It's the highest since September 2008. And output price inflation is 9.1% at the moment, and it's the highest since September 2008. And again, these numbers will be updated very shortly, and I think they're just going to rise even further. The fact that input price inflation has been greater than output price inflation, in fact, that's been the situation since the winter of 2015. This is telling us that margins are under pressure and that firms are not able to fully pass on the cost increases which they're having to face. So it's showing that the price increases are not able to be pushed right down throughout the supply chain, and that everybody's taking a bit of a hit. Input price inflation is still very much due to crude oil prices, which are up 81% year on year. And I think yesterday, in recent days, the price of Brent oil has been increasing again. It's up to about 86 now. So again, there's not going to be any easing of this in the near future. Metal prices are also strong, up 22%, and chemicals up 15%. So these are the main contributors to producer price inflation. In terms of output prices, it's petrol prices up 86% year on year, metal prices up 13% and chemicals up 12%. So, this is where all the stresses and strains are coming through. So the cost pressures are clearly still there. Producers not able to fully pass these on. Hence, we're seeing the decreases or more rising concern about profitability and cash flow. And unfortunately, it looks like the situation is still going to be tough over the next few months. And I think, as businesses are grappling with these rising costs and trying to deal with supply chain challenges, there's also lots of questions at the moment about wages and what's happening there. So I want to look at this in the next slide. This slide is showing regular pay growth. Regular meaning that there's no bonuses or anything included in it. It's a basic wages. And what we're looking at is the pink line showing nominal pay. So that's, the level of pay that people are actually given. And the orange line is looking at real pay. So it's accounting for the inflation as it is at the moment. And what you can see is that both of these have decreased sharply in the last couple of months, and regular real pay has decreased even faster, and that's because the inflation rate has moved even higher. And in fact, we've had an update to these numbers this morning, and regular pay, which had been at 4.3% growth in nominal terms, has fallen to 3.8%. And so the fact that inflation is running at 4.6 and expected to be even higher tomorrow suggests that regular pay in real terms has now dipped below the axis, so it's in negative territory. So it's telling us that we cannot buy now the equivalent of what we were able to purchase last year with the same level of pay. We have to be careful interpreting this chart, because it looks on the surface as if there was a massive increase in pay over the last year. But what happened was, when the lockdown initially occurred and we had the introduction of the furlough scheme, a lot of people furloughed dropped to sort of 80% of their regular pay, and that has caused a dip in regular pay or wages in the summer of last year. And then as people returned to work, you can see that it looked as if they were achieving a big pay increase. So instead of getting 80% of salary, back up to 100%. So that looked like strong wage gains, but really it was just a reversal of the pandemic situation and the furlough scheme. The furlough scheme has clearly been a big winner in terms of saving the economy overall. But it does mean we have to be careful how we interpret this. So if you look at what's happened to pay now, it is coming, if you look at the pink line, it's coming back down to more normal levels. But as I said, the caution here is that regular pay in real terms, because inflation is so high, is not keeping up. And that suggests that spending could weaken further. And if companies are forced to increase pay levels, then that again is going to be another challenge in terms of profitability and cash flow. So difficult situation still facing the corporate sector over the next few months. In reaction to what's been going on, it's interesting to look and see what's been happening to interest rates. And this next chart is looking at monetary policy in the UK. And I wanted to finish by looking at monetary policy, because a lot of our attention has been on the fiscal side, and obviously lots of fears of what's coming to meet us on the fiscal side with the tax increases in this year, increase in national insurance, the threshold remaining unchanged, and even the VAT on petrol is obviously hitting everybody hard. But I think monetary policy is going to be really critical moving forward from here, and I think that's something that we really do need to keep an eye on. So the first chart here is looking at the policy rate of interest and how that has moved over the last few years. And you know, you can see the cut which came in after the Brexit referendum, and then a reversal of that because things didn't deteriorate as much as the Bank of England had been expecting. And then a small increase back, we got back up to 0.75% before the pandemic hit. Then we had two very quick cuts, so almost looks like one massive cut in interest rates, which took us down to just 0.1%, and that's where we had been for a while. But as we saw inflation starting to rise last year and, you know, the economy recovering, the central bank obviously didn't want to keep monetary policy as loose as it was. And there was a couple of times when it looked like they were going to increase, but they didn't actually deliver. But back in December, we did see the first increase. Personally, I didn't think they should increase rates because for all the reasons I've been saying, the inflation that's coming through is not the good kind of inflation, it's the burden that's being placed on everybody. But looking at the chart, you can see the move in perspective and the fact that it's just bringing us back to where we were, even just post-Brexit referendum. So it's still relatively low. And in terms of interest rates, what we also need to look at is not the nominal level as you're seeing here, but again, the real rate of interest, so adjusting it for inflation. And given what's been happening to inflation, this means that the official or the policy rate of interest in real terms is still negative. And moving ever more so negative. So it's still very, very loose conditions that we're seeing. How does this all affect the economy? Well, sometimes it works through the exchange rate. So this next chart is looking at the sterling dollar exchange rate. This reflects confidence in the UK economy and the management of the UK economy. You can see there was a big dip in sterling in the spring of last year, and that's when the pandemic hit. And there was a race to the safe haven of the dollar. So whenever there's an international crisis, you do see the dollar strengthening because it seems to be such a safe haven. But since then, you can see the move in sterling up until the spring of last year was quite strong. It was an upward movement, and then it's just been waning a bit since then. But it's still holding up okay around the between 135, 140 at the moment. So this is helping us in some ways because a lot of the inflation, the price increases that we're looking at are energy related, and these goods are priced in dollars. So if sterling can hold up well against the dollar, we don't see any additional impact from there. The danger is that if confidence is lost in the UK for any reason and sterling weakens, then you have an added burden coming through in that the oil price being charged in dollars is going to be an even burden to pay for those of us working here in sterling terms. So apologies, it's all a bit pessimistic at the moment. I think our survey results, as we said, were muted, but they were still quite encouraging given the situation that we were in. But there's no escaping the fact that over the next few months in particular, the burden of energy costs is going to be a big burden that we're all going to have to meet, and the role of policymakers is going to be extremely significant going forward from here. And on that very cheerful note, I will finish and pass back to Alison.
Thanks, Shona. I get that challenge of stopping sharing, unmuting, trying to remember I'm still on video. Thank you. So I think I will, because I was sharing my screen, I know that there was some conversation going on in the chat while you were speaking and I was sharing our screen. So I'll pick those up, and then I've got a few kind of points myself. And then, as I say, if anybody wants to come in, then please put your hand up or jump into the chat and say you'd like to come in. So, Shona, I guess I've got less questions this time. I think that probably means that you've been more comprehensive, or as comprehensive as always. But I guess it's maybe just more observations, and we'll kind of see what kind of comes out of that. But the respondents' increase in prices raises probably naive questions in my head, and I guess, you know, we've seen, I think, that you've demonstrated that people have found it difficult to actually pass price increases on in the past year. So I'm guessing people are beginning. So is it good that we're seeing people feel now that they can be confident in passing price increases on? So that's question number one, I think. And question, or the other side of that then, is what's the impact then on inflation? How quickly does a business price increase pass its way through and come out the other end in inflation rises?
Okay, yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of whether the intention to increase prices is a sign of confidence or a sign of weakness. and I think that possibly depends on what sector a business is working in, and what the whole sort of cash flow mechanics are of individual companies. So, I mean, I think in terms of looking at GDP and, you know, some of the consumer confidence surveys, it's good to see that the economy has been recovering. Okay, growth this time was a bit more muted, but it was still growth. And we get monthly GDP numbers as well coming through, and the last one showed that, if it's not revised, that we are back at pre-pandemic levels of activity. So I think against that backdrop, the labour market hasn't weakened nearly as much as could have been the case. Yes, there's an issue in that a lot of people have disappeared from the labour market. I think this morning they're estimating it's about 400,000 who have just sort of gone, and so they're not counting themselves as being active anymore. So it's a bit weaker than it looks on the surface. But having said that, you know, the furlough scheme, etc., has clearly been successful and stopped the unemployment rate rising as much as it would have done. And all of that, I think, has engendered a bit more confidence in consumers. The vaccine coming through, the fact that, you know, we're in a totally different place regarding COVID than we were a year ago. The fact, I think, the feeling, yes, we are getting through this, we can cope with all of this now, means that in certain sectors, consumers are very happy to spend. They're more willing to spend now, they've got their confidence back. And the savings rate had gone up, so consumers have the money to spend. But of course, as we say, in other sectors where the price, it's more necessary to increase prices just to try and cover costs. So if you're using a lot of energy in your production, or to transport your goods, then I think it's a tougher situation, because you're facing the costs coming through, and it's more a reflection to cost push rather than demand pull. So demand pull inflation tends to be good inflation because it's a sign of activity and growth, and cost push inflation is bad inflation because it's just a burden on everybody. In terms of how quickly it gets through, it gets through fairly quick. There's a bit of a, if you want to see inflation, especially in energy costs, etc., starting to come through the system, you look at import prices first, and that's where you pick up the initial move, and that reflects the sort of sterling effect on inflation. And then it comes into producer input prices, then producer output prices, and then into consumer prices. But consumer prices is calculated by, basically they've got a big shopping bag, shopping basket of various goods and services, and every month, I think it's actually on the day the inflation numbers are released, they go and do the next month's shopping. So as soon as a price increase comes through for, you know, like petrol at the pumps, it's already getting picked up. So it comes through fairly quickly, but there is a whole chain to work through before it gets to the producer level. But between producer and consumer can be quite quick.
Thanks. And I think just picking up then on, you talked a little bit about supply chain, and I know, we're hearing from businesses that supply chain is still a huge issue. There's either an issue with getting, what people need, and I think that impacts on investment or kind of productivity, because it means that businesses maybe have got orders that they can't fulfill, therefore they're not pushing ahead with them and maybe not making the investments that they might be making. But the price of kind of getting raw materials and other things is still really prohibitive. And I'm kind of curious. I mean, I think we've talked in the past about, this is a kind of a global issue. And I'm assuming it's kind of still got that global element to it. We haven't talked about Brexit at all this time around, and Brexit is definitely still, feeling being felt in the background. So I'm just wondering, I guess, about that, the supply chain. Are the supply issues beginning to settle? I think we've talked about in the past that China had been, for example, drawing a lot of steel and other kind of resources, and is that partly because of where they are at in the pandemic? Because for a while they were certainly back open and faster than us, but I think we saw in the last few months some of their cities completely going into quite a significant, serious lockdown. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you can shed a light on any of that, or if it's just my musings.
Well, in China, the last GDP report was pretty weak. I think it had a 4 in front of it instead of an 8. So a sign that nobody's escaping from this. We're seeing in terms of semiconductors and so on, it's clearly there's a global shortage, and in a lot of sectors, we're still playing catch up through the pandemic. So when we had lockdowns, maintenance couldn't be done, a lot of factories were shut, and that sort of created the first signs of issues in supply chains. But there's still follow on from that, because the maintenance that wasn't done last year had to be done then this year, and again you had another sort of blip because of that. And so in certain sectors it is still a big problem. I think energy is a case in point, in that last year in Asia, it was extremely cold and there was a huge demand for energy in the winter months. And in China in particular, lots of power cuts, and the government has sort of said no power cuts this year. So companies have had to buy ahead and stock up on enough energy to get them through a very cold winter. And again, you had lots of maintenance catch up, etc. So I think the energy costs, we're living in this period where there's been so much getting held on reserve. If there isn't a very cold winter, then the energy prices should start to fall considerably. But of course, if there is a cold spell, and not just, it's not what happens here that matters so much as what's happening in Asia, then prices could go even higher, and we're all going to have to pay the burden of that. So I think we're in certain sectors, we're certainly not through the supply chain issues by any means. And the motor car, second-hand cars and that is reflecting some of the issues with the semiconductors. I think in terms of Brexit, it's added an administrative burden onto that for certain sectors. And it seems from where I'm sitting that that's the, it's the time, it's the admin burden, etc. Rather than a physical shortage, is filling in all the paperwork to get it, which is adding to the costs of businesses trying to trade.
On the positive side of what's happening with Brexit, there certainly seem to be a lot of good noises coming out of some of the trade deals and the trade deal discussions that are going on. And I wonder if that yet impacting on what we're seeing, people's, or the global confidence in doing business with the UK now that we're no longer part of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's taken time to show up in the numbers. But I think in the last trade report, trade with the rest of the world was actually higher than trade with Europe for, you know, the first time. I think that was imports, the first time for ages. So it's beginning to show up in the numbers, but it's just going to be a lengthy process. Trade deals can take a notoriously long time to negotiate, and okay, there'll be some early successes where the deal is pretty similar to what we had before, but some of the others will take longer. So it's not something which is just going to change overnight. It's something, you know, this is a long-term sort of structural type of move.
The job market and pay increases and all of that is clearly a really complicated set of scenarios. But, you know, there's been some questions about, you know, if profits and cash flow are down in businesses, then does that mean businesses won't be employing new staff? And I think that's definitely a valid point. But then I know that we have got significant numbers of businesses that just can't get enough staff, and that's to a background where we wondered if furlough would release a bunch of people who would then be looking for kind of new opportunities. And that sort of, all of that stumps me slightly, that it hasn't really played out in the way that maybe we thought it might.
I think it's still early days, to be honest. Employment tends to be a lagging indicator because every step in the procedure takes time. And I think we still have to see a lot of the effects of the shakeout due to COVID. They're clearly in some sectors, well, the hospitality sector, clear example, where they were basically shut for several months last year. Many people left the sector and moved into other areas. And then, as I said earlier, we've got, you know, a lot of people who have basically removed themselves from the labour market at the moment, either taking early retirement or being caught up with family care, etc. I mean, all sorts of reasons why people have decided not to look for a job. Possibly just the fact there weren't many jobs available at the time, you know, depending on your skill set. So I think we do have, there's more of this to come. What's always surprised me in our results to date is that the employment indicator had held up so well, because I kept expecting it to deteriorate, and every quarter businesses were saying we're going to be employing more people in the next quarter, and I was always thinking, I doubt that's going to be the case, but no, it was. And this is the first time where we've actually seen that negative reading coming through. But again, looking forward, every business is looking to either maintain their staff or increase the staff. I think wages is going to be the big issue, because obviously with costs rising as sharply as they have, everybody's struggling. So workers are looking for a real increase and not to be worse off than they were last year, but firms are going to find it difficult to make that payment. And if they do make that payment, inflation goes even higher, because, and this is where it becomes sort of self-feeding. And the Bank of England always gets very concerned if wage growth gets towards 4%, or certainly in the past, in the normal world. They got worried around those levels, because that's when it starts to get baked in, and wage increases start to sort of spiral, and inflation can get a bit out of control for them. So I think that's one of the reasons that they made that move in interest rates, just to send a signal that, you know, we're being proactive rather than reactive, and that we're ready to move. And I think that's why we need to look at monetary policy going forward, as much as we know fiscal policy is going to be a burden. We know we're going to be paying more in taxes. And I think there's a bit more of an unknown about what's happening on the monetary side.
Yeah, I think that's where it can often feel like one thing happens independent of another, because I think that interest rate rise happened. We then went into, you know, a pretty significant challenge in December with Omicron, where governments have acted and businesses really suffered. and we've now got quite a lot of people that are off work because they're isolating or have caught COVID. So, then the impact of trying to, I mean, we've all seen businesses cut their hours and or cut their services because they've just not got enough people at the moment to kind of. So yeah, I think our next quarter is going to be incredibly difficult to kind of unpick what's actually really happening rather than that very short-term look. But is it easy? Well, it's not easy, otherwise I would be doing your job. But the regular pay growth chart, I felt was, it's very difficult to strip furlough out from those numbers and actually get a real read on what that chart is doing without furlough. But it does seem like there are regular pay growth trends in there. But offset. But then we haven't even talked about house prices and what's kind of happening in the housing market this time around. And it seems to be that the housing market is really, really kind of very vibrant, and people are paying a lot over the odds for houses at the moment. So that will be impacting on our numbers, I would have thought, in the next few quarters too.
I think, throughout this coming year, I think that there's still going to be a lot of things we have to consider relating to COVID, and still the sort of moves because of that. I think in terms of wages, with the chart of showing regular pay is very bumpy, and if we updated it for this morning's numbers, it's even worse. But you can see the sort of long-term trend line in terms of total pay rather than or nominal rather than real. I think wages really are still just around the sort of 2% level, but we know anecdotally that in certain sectors where they're really struggling to get people, really having to pay up in order. And what we don't see, what we're looking at in the chart I showed is headline UK wide. So big movements in some sectors don't really show as much when you're looking at the nation as a whole. I think in terms of what we're going to see for growth next year, it is going to be bumpy again. Although there weren't official restrictions imposed at the end of last year, households imposed on themselves and sort of went into lockdown. So certain sectors clearly suffered hugely, and that will wash through in the figures. In terms of housing, etc., I think there's a bit of a structural change going on there. So COVID made us all sit back and sort of question our lives and what we were doing, where we were, where we wanted to be, etc. So I think clearly there's been high demand for housing in certain areas, less urban type areas and so on. So I think there's still a lot to go there. And yeah, I think we're going to be talking about COVID for some time to come, not necessarily because it's impacting the present, but because the repercussions of what we've been through are still working through the system.
Yeah, and I think that, so I don't really think we've got any other comments in the chat, and I don't really have anything else to say, but I think, like you said, I think at one point that, this is about, what's happening to the economy, what's happening to our businesses, and along with, what the Bank of England can do, and kind of policymakers and others can do. It's all got to be very intertwined, otherwise it becomes real burden, doesn't it? So I guess that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I wrote down, government have got to take these signals into consideration when they're looking to increase company costs without any associated stimulus, because otherwise it spirals, doesn't it? And businesses are going to find it incredibly difficult, I think, to get ahead of this. I guess there's been some positives, and I'm interested to see what our kind of next set of data is going to look like, because it's definitely been a tricky few weeks since we began to gather this data. So Shona, thank you so much as always. I think there are some really interesting and key points to take out of it. Some of it clearly was beginning to show real kind of optimism, and some of it's seasonal, but it's hugely beneficial for for local policymakers and others to know exactly what's going on in our different sectors. And even the fact that we have all these different sectors is such a strength of our region, but it doesn't make your job particularly easy, Shona, does it? Because there's lots of sectors to kind of get our head around. So I think what we'll do is we'll get our recording of the session all organised and up there. Thank you so much to everybody that's taken the time to come on. Shona, thank you as always for all your hard work. We'll put out an email to everybody that turned up today just to say thank you and ask for a little bit of extra feedback. And we have got another survey as part of our work with British Chambers of Commerce. The BCC Business Outlook Survey for 2022 is live at the moment, and that's asking businesses to kind of come in and comment about how they are feeling about inflation and COVID and Brexit and a whole bunch of different things. So, you know, we would really appreciate businesses taking the time to jump in and just answer that survey for British Chambers of Commerce as well. So Shona, thank you so much. Thank you to Sarah for getting us all organised today, and thank you to those of you that came on, and also if you came on and you participated in the survey, then huge thank you very much from me, and thank you to everybody that did fill in the survey. We very much appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and I will catch up with you all, no doubt, at some other event. Thanks very much, folks. Thank you.